It seems to be the case that every second article is regarding inflation, and everybody is blaming everybody. The Republicans are blaming the Democrats are blaming the Republicans, the president is blaming Amazon, and Amazon is giving it right back to them. All the while, Jerome Powell over at the Fed is printing money through the nose. And the question is, who is actually right? Well, today we're going to answer that question of who's really to blame for inflation. And we're going to do that by looking briefly at what inflation is, what causes it, and then who pulls the levers that lead to those causes. If we can figure that out, we can figure out who's to blame for inflation. If that sounds good to you, let's get into it. There's a famous story of an economist that wanted to see what the future held. So he put himself under ice via cryogenics and told his stockbroker to manage his money and that he'd be back in 20 years. Well, sure enough, 20 years passed, and the first thing he did was run to the telephone booth and call his stockbroker to see how his stocks had done. Much to his delight, the stockbroker told him that he was a millionaire many times over, and they spent the next 3 minutes talking about which stocks performed well and which stocks performed poorly, but overall the man couldn't have been happier. He was then interrupted by a robotic voice that told him, "The first 3 minutes of your call are up. Please insert $250,000 for another 3 minutes." Now, of course, it's crazy for us to consider that in 20 years a telephone bill could be $250,000 for every 3 minutes. But the truth is that this isn't absurd in many countries. For example, in 1946 in Hungary, they experienced insane inflation. Specifically, their inflation numbers were 41.9 trillion % inflation per month, which means that prices of goods doubled every 15 hours. And you might be thinking, well, that was 1946, surely we've progressed since then. Well, in Zimbabwe in 2008, they experienced a similar level of inflation. But in this case, goods doubled every 25 hours, meaning a week from today, the average Chipotle bowl would be worth around $91. Now, the good news for us is that economists have studied inflation extensively and know the exact reason for inflation. And it's simpler than you think. You've probably heard that weight gain or loss is as simple as calories in and calories out. Well, when it comes to inflation, it's the same concept, except it's money in and money out. The general rule is that when money is input into an economy, the prices of everything will increase. Stocks, airfares, groceries, the lot. And then when money is taken out of the economy, meaning there is less money to go around for everybody, the prices of goods drop. A common way that many economists have phrased this is that inflation is an increasing amount of money chasing a limited supply of products. So the relationship between money supply and inflation has been very well studied, and you'd struggle to find an economist that would disagree with the relationship between the two. In fact, if you look at this graph, you can see the relationship between money supply on the x-axis and CPI, or Consumer Price Index, which is inflation, on the y-axis. Overall, you can see that the general trend is linearly upwards from the bottom left to the top right, suggesting that there is a correlation between the two variables. So given that money supply is the key factor in determining inflation, the question is, how do we increase the money supply? Or more importantly, who can increase the money supply? There are a variety of ways that this can be done, but I'm going to focus on the two most common ways, which make up about 95% of the reason for inflation. The first one is via the Federal Reserve, which is the bank of banks. And the Federal Reserve can influence the amount of money in an economy by either buying or selling bonds. When they buy bonds from the public, they are getting bonds and giving dollars into society, meaning the money supply is increasing. The reverse is true. When they sell bonds, they are taking money out of the economy. Now, the most important thing here is that the Federal Reserve is completely autonomous and independent, meaning they can make monetary policy moves without needing any oversight from Congress or the executive branch at all. And so you might be thinking, we found our culprits. It's the Federal Reserve that we have to blame, and specifically the man at the top, Jerome Money Printin' Powell. But don't be too hasty, because the second reason contributes even more to inflation than the first, and this is an excess spend over and above the federal budget. Every year, the US government puts forth a general budget that they plan to spend over the course of that coming year. In this budget, they estimate how much tax revenue they expect to collect, i.e. how much money we've paid in taxes and corporations have paid in taxes, against how much they plan to spend on social programs, whether that's Social Security or defense. If the government spends $100 million in a given year, but only collects $60 million in that same year, there's a $40 million deficit in that year. Now, who pays that $40 million? Where does it come from? Well, one way to think about it is that the $100 $10 million that the US spent in the economy that year was offset by $60 million of money they collected. But that $40 million was essentially excess money that they put in the same way that the Federal Reserve might inject money into the economy as well, meaning that any year that the US has had a federal deficit, they are contributing to the inflation rate. This graph here is data supplied directly from the US, and you can see that the last time the US government had a surplus was in 2001. The deficit remained less than half a trillion until about 2009 when, in response to the Great Recession, they pumped money into the economy. This slowly died down by 2015 and then recently increased over threefold for the COVID-19 pandemic. While the average deficit was about 1 trillion, meaning they spent 1 trillion more than the money they brought in, now it is $3 trillion per year for approximately the last 2 years. So let's get down to brass tacks. Who's to blame here? Is it the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell, or is it Congress and the President? While the Federal Reserve can act independently, its governors are appointed by the President. And the President is, of course, voted in by us. And then with the federal budget each year, even though it's approved by Congress, it is put forth by the President, meaning two branches of government are involved. And in all of those cases, they're elected officials. We vote in the Congress people, we vote in the President, and so the bittersweet truth of the matter is that the people to blame are us. This opinion isn't even my own. It was actually said first by the famous economist Milton Friedman. Milton said that we shoot ourselves in the foot by saying to congressmen that we want more stuff, but we want federal taxes to remain low. So elected officials, in order to stay elected, must give us more things while keeping our taxes low, which inevitably increases the federal deficit, which leads to increased inflation. It's a bittersweet truth because while no one likes to be told that they're partially at fault for the situation that we find ourselves in, it does mean that, unlike other countries, we can do something about it. Specifically, we can learn up on high level but relatively simple macroeconomics and then vote in people and lobby for policies that service us in the long run and don't satisfy our greedy needs in the short run. Alright guys, that's enough from me. I'm going to leave you with some famous words from Milton Friedman.
President Carter, would you advise him to work through the Federal Reserve or through Congress to implement your recommendation?
Well, I'm not sure those are different, and I'm not sure it's really President Carter to work through them. You know, the president has a lot of influence but very little power. The president does not pass the appropriation bills. The president has no direct control over the Federal Reserve printing press. The real source of power in this respect are the Congress and the Federal Reserve together and jointly. And I believe that's where the public at large has to bring political pressure to bear to produce the right kind of policy.
So we need to change Congress to get off the treadmill.
No, we don't need to change Congress, excuse me. You know, people have a great misunderstanding about this. People in Congress are in a business. They're trying to buy votes. They're in the business of competing with one another to get elected. The same congressman will vote for a different thing if he thinks that's politically profitable. You don't have to change Congress. People have a great misconception in this way. They think the way you solve things is by electing the right people. It's nice to elect the right people, but that isn't the way you solve things. The way you solve things is by making it politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right things.